I think a lot of times we think about all those benefits and we don't really pause to consider that there are some downsides. There are some serious drawbacks to taking on a side project. And one of those, and perhaps the biggest one that people underestimate, is divided focus. What I mean is you only have so much of your energy you can focus on something. And very frequently we think purely in terms of time, right? Maybe you've gotten into productivity and you're like, I'm able to accomplish my work and do that really well. I feel like I'm doing that excellently. And I have this extra time that instead of watching TV in the evening, maybe I could work on a side project. But what we don't account for is that divided focus, that there is a cost to splitting your attention between two big endeavors like your main vocation and some side project. And in fact, this is something that I thought about when I was at the point where I was considering doing Redeeming Productivity full time. So those of you who are newer to the podcast may not know sort of my background. I kind of talked about this on the podcast as I went through this transition a few years ago. But basically, I was working for a Christian ministry out in California, forgot the name of it, Grace to You. And it was my dream job. I loved it. But during COVID, we kind of realized we didn't want to be in California. We wanted to be closer to family. And so we moved back here and I started working for the Babylon Bee's sister site, Not the Bee, kind of working in the news, entertainment type stuff. Did not love it. It was not my cup of tea, to be honest with you. And so in that process, I was sort of at this crossroads where I was doing Redeeming Productivity all throughout that time. I did it while I was at Grace to You. I did it while I was working for Not the Bee. It was just this side thing. And I was at this crossroads where I was thinking, I either need to stop doing this because it's taking too much of my attention, doing Redeeming Productivity, or I need to go all in on it. And obviously, spoiler, I ended up going all in on it. But one of the things that helped me make that decision was this insight into how my attention was being divided and how unhelpful that was. And in fact, it was reading a newsletter from Aaron Wrenn. He writes, I don't know if he still calls it The Masculinist, but he writes these newsletters, and he wrote one several years ago, and I read it, and he had some interesting insights in there that I really took to heart. So I want to share a couple quotes from that edition of his newsletter that really were convicting to me. So the first one, he says, if you have a side hustle, then you lack focus on your main gig. That's going to undermine your performance at some level. That's an interesting one. I hadn't really considered that it's not just a time equation, that I at some level have divided attention. And maybe you found this. Maybe you already have a side gig or a side hustle and it's taking your attention away from the main thing you're doing. You might even be shortchanging your employer. In fact, I knew a guy who a while back, he worked a full-time job, but all the time during his working hours, he was trying to start some other venture. And I don't think that that's right? That's kind of stealing from your employer. You're supposed to be focused on the work at hand. And so that can be an extreme example of your attention being divided so much that it's pulling you away from your main gig. But there's also, in addition to like the moral issue there's an issue of lack of focus can make it so you do both things poorly, right? Aaron Wrenn continues. Here's another quote from that edition of his newsletter. He said, having taken on multiple side hustles, I'm obviously a fan, but I would encourage you not to underestimate the risks and downsides of dividing your focus. From a purely professional point of view, I would probably have been better off financially by never taking on any side hustles and simply doubling down with all my energy on consulting. And so he's just speaking of his own experience that, hey, there was a cost to me taking on these side hustles in that I didn't give myself fully to my job, and I probably would have risen faster, made more money doing that. And so that is a legitimate just consideration for you before you make the decision to divide your attention into a side hustle. Or if you already are doing a side hustle and you're thinking, oh man, this is making extra money, but I feel split between these two. Recognize that may be what's happening. And so that's not necessarily like, oh, you should never do it. Again, that's not what Wren's saying. That's not what I'm saying. but it is a consideration. And think about it like this. We've talked several weeks ago, maybe it was a couple months ago now, about this idea of domains of stewardship and picturing your life as an arch, right? You have the spiritual domain that's sort of the keystone to all of your life stewardship. And you've got relationships and your finances, all these different areas. One of the big areas God has given you to steward, though, is your vocation, right? Whatever your calling is. So that may be your career, that may be if you're a homemaker, if you're a retiree, whatever the main thing is you do, that's an area that you want to be faithful in to steward well. What can happen is if you take on side hustles is you can sort of split this domain of stewardship and you kind of bifurcate it in such that now you have two vocations. And this produces some problems for you. Not that there's anything inherently wrong with having two vocations, but again, you can't give yourself fully to it. Obviously, we know that's true of time, but I think the bigger negative consequence is on what we might call mind share or our attention. Another way to picture it is if you kind of picture your brain, right? If you have your main gig, your main vocation, 100% of your working hours, your vocation minutes of your day are dedicated to that, right? Theoretically. And so when you're at work, you're at work. That's the thing you're focused on. And even when you're away from work, sometimes you're taking a shower, you're going for a drive, you're thinking, how am I going to solve that problem at work? But what happens when you take on a side project is now that attention is divided. You have more mind share. Part of your brain is thinking about the main gig, and part of it is thinking about the side gig. Something we may very well underestimate is that another portion of your brain is taken up with sort of managing this split focus, mental overhead on this. Now in your spare time, sometimes you're thinking about the side gig, sometimes you're thinking about the main thing. And there's a task cost to switching between those two modes of thinking. And so that's just a long-winded way of saying, make sure that as you think about the drawbacks of potentially taking a side gig or continuing a side gig, make sure you're recognizing that divided attention, divided focus is a serious thing, and you want to be sure that you don't live this way forever. And that's sort of, I guess, maybe the big point that I want to make here is if you do take on a side project or a side gig, think of it as something you're doing for a season. Don't think of it as, this is what I'm going to do forever, because it's not going to work. It's not going to work in the long run. So either you want to take that side gig and turn it into something that you just enjoy, it's a hobby, and so it has its own place, or if you're going to take it and make it some sort of source of financial revenue for you, you got to make sure you have an end goal for it. Is this something going to fit in my life just for the season to kind of make up some shortfalls financially? Or am I planning on taking this full time eventually? Because you're just not going to live in that state forever where you've got two things occupying your attention. It will eventually burn you out.